Welcome back to another video in our ongoing series on church history. Last time we talked about persecution in the early church. We saw that it was sporadic, it was localized, but at times it was intense and downright brutal. Christians being thrown to the beasts, crucified, lit on fire to light up garden parties. And probably the most brutal, the most severe, was the final wave of imperial persecution started during the reign of the Emperor Diocletian in 303 AD, lasting until 313, when Emperor Constantine issued the Edict of Milan, which guaranteed the toleration of Christianity. Now, contrary to popular belief, Constantine didn't actually make the Roman Empire Christian. He did officially declare Christianity a compatible religion within the empire. So let's talk a little bit about Constantine. He reigned from about 306 to 337 AD. At some point, he was co-emperor with a guy named Licinius. And among his other accomplishments, he reunified the fractured empire. He moved the capital from Rome to Byzantium, which he renamed Constantinople in his own honor. It's today named Istanbul in modern Turkey. But it was his Edict of Milan and relationship to Christianity that are perhaps most significant. He was the illegitimate son of a Roman military leader and a Christian freedwoman named Helena. Even before he had some sort of spiritual experience, which we'll talk about shortly, even before that, Constantine had believed that Christianity would be beneficial for the empire. Even if it wasn't true, he found it to be practically helpful. After all, it's estimated that about 10% of the empire confessed the faith in the early 4th century. But in 312, he had an experience that significantly changed the way he thought of the faith. He was outnumbered. He was overwhelmed at the Battle of the Milvian Bridge over the Tiber River in northern Rome against a rival to the throne named Maxentius. As the battle raged, he had a vision of a Christian symbol and the Latin phrase, in hoc signo vinces, which means, in this sign conquer. And he took it as an omen from a god. The symbol was the Chi Rho, which you're probably familiar with here at Reformation. The Chi looking like an X, a Rho looking like a P. Chi Rho were the first two letters of Christ in Greek. So Constantine ordered the Chi Rho added to his soldiers' shields and banners. He won the victory. He interpreted his win as owing to the favor of the Christian God. Now, his actual motivations are much less well known, but it is known that this set off a series of events that would lead to the legalization of Christianity as it's declared a religio licita, or legal religion. Eventually, these events would lead to the conversion of the empire. That was 312. So the next year, he issues the Edict of Milan, the Edict of Toleration, that officially declared Christianity a legal religion. Now, this was obviously a huge benefit for Christianity. It means no longer would Christians be formally persecuted. But not only was it a boon for Christianity, indeed, this might have been one of the first ever policies of freedom of religion, as the edict basically guaranteed the rights of all to worship according to their own religion. As mentioned last time, Judaism had enjoyed this right, at least a form of this right, at various times. This was the first time, though, that Christianity was acknowledged as being a separate religion and officially legal. So it went from being illegal and subject to various waves of persecution to being permitted nearly overnight, and soon it would be the major faith of the empire. As a result of the Edict of Milan, churches were given their property back. They were subsidized by the state. Christians were given back their confiscated property. Clergy were exempted from public service. Sunday was declared as an official day of rest and worship, not only in recognition of Christ's resurrection, but also due to the fact that there was a famous sun god whose day was Sunday. In fact, that's where we get the word Sunday. Now, in this environment, the church thrived and began to exercise ever greater levels of influence. In fact, the term paganism was coined around this time in church history. The Latin word paganus means rural or rustic, but has the connotation of someone uneducated, kind of like our phrases hillbilly or country bumpkin. The use of pagan to refer to non-Christians came about because the people in villages were still worshiping rivers and trees and the old Roman gods. The more refined people, the Christians, called these backwoods, superstitious people pagans. Now, another significant accomplishment of Constantine was in calling the famous Council of Nicaea in 325. We'll actually talk about that next time. It's obvious, though, that Constantine did a lot to help the church. That's historically certain. What's not quite so certain was the state of Constantine's own soul, his own faith. Was he actually a Christian? That's the question that historians debate. The Eastern Orthodox Church certainly thinks so, given that he's considered a saint, Saint Constantine the Great. That makes sense, given that he moved the capital to Constantinople, which was, for a long time, the geographic center and capital of Eastern Orthodoxy. But on the other hand, Constantine was baptized by an Arian who denied the deity of Christ. He delayed his own baptism until his deathbed. He kept the title of Pontifex Maximus, or chief priest of the pagan state religion. He continued worshiping other gods. He even killed his own son and wife under suspicious circumstances. At the very least, Christ was seen by him as a useful tool to unify the empire. But the degree to which he himself trusted in Christ is a matter of debate. He found Christianity to be expedient, not necessarily true. You might compare him to Trump a little bit. Certainly convinced Christianity is useful, but a bit suspect as to his own beliefs. I think it likely that he honored the Christian God as one among others, maybe even one much more powerful than others, but he wasn't fully devoted to the Christian faith. Others think he had a conversion experience. Now, as mentioned, Constantine's signature accomplishments as far as church history were the calling of the Council of Nicaea, that we'll talk about next time, and the declaration of Christianity as a religio licita, a legal and recognized religion. But again, he didn't make the empire Christian. He simply made the empire accepting of Christianity, and that pattern continued with subsequent emperors. That remained the case until 361, when a man named Julian became emperor. He's known to church history as Julian the Apostate because he tried to turn the empire back to paganism. He took back all of the church's privileges. He even forbid Christians from teaching. He was killed by spear in battle, and according to legend, his last words were, "You have won, Galilean." After that, things returned to the Constantinian model of toleration and remained that way until 380, when Theodosius I, in his Edict of Thessalonica, made Christianity the official religion of the empire, and thus Christendom was born. By 392, all pagan worship, whether private or public, was forbidden. That then set the pattern of Christendom that would last in some way or another for the next 1,500 years. Now, in many ways, this was a positive development for the church. After all, Christians were not being persecuted anymore. Various immoralities, such as gladiatorial games and sexual licentiousness and infanticide, were outlawed. Women and slaves were afforded more honor. Church offices were granted tax-exempt status, and missionaries and ministry work was made easier. At the same time, these various benefits were accompanied by some costs. For instance, the emperor generally possessed too much control over the church. False conversions became common because it became so easy. Pagan practices were brought into the church in a practice called syncretism, the blending together of various religions. Pastors began adopting Roman patterns of wearing luxurious robes and garments and living luxurious lives and being exalted above the laity. So you see this distinction between clergy and laity. In other words, the ostensibly narrow road of Christianity had become quite wide. Now, all in all, I think that the conversion of the empire was a net positive, but as with Israel's history, we see the same pattern in the church. Anytime things get easy, the church tends to grow fat and lazy. All kinds of immorality enter in. Wandering in the wilderness, gathering manna day by day, it's easy to tangibly see and taste and feel your dependence on the Lord. But once you arrive in the promised land, once you taste the milk and the honey, once you have a little bit of savings in your account, that can be abstracted. You can become distracted and arrogant. And that's what's happened to the early church as well. So what should we do today? Some would say that the lesson to learn from this is that Christians should therefore resist power, resist influence, simply hide on the margins of society. The problem with that is that Christ hasn't called us to hide. He's called us to make disciples, quote, of all nations. He hasn't called us to avoid power, but He has called us to steward it wisely. The lesson to learn isn't for the church to resist power and influence, but rather to be careful and consider the costs that accompany such blessings, to be humble, dependent, to be aware of the dangers as well as the benefits of influence, to see the enemy is able to seduce in the midst of prosperity as well as adversity. This historical survey should also give us hope. God's kingdom is advancing. The gates of hell will not prevail. In 33 AD, there were a few hundred followers of Christ on the planet. By 60 AD, there were a few thousand. By 350, there were nearly 32 million, which represented about 53% of the total population of the empire. As Christ says, this little mustard seed grows into a large tree as the kingdom expands. Likewise, we today face various pressures, even persecution in various places. As in Constantine's days, our country is fractured, our money is depressed, our culture is pagan. But the same thing is true today that was true then. It was true in the days of the psalmist who wrote, "Our God is in the heavens, He does all that He pleases." Our goal, our mission is the same: make disciples of all nations. Next time, we'll talk about another signature accomplishment of Constantine and the Council of Nicaea in particular, and in councils in general. See you then.